Hello everyone, welcome back to Just My Stupid Opinion. I'm Adrian Lloyd. So today I wanted to talk to you about something. For the last few weeks I've been reading this book, Tragedy and Hope, a history of the world in our time by Carol Quigley. Now I was initially put onto this book by another YouTuber whose channel goes by the name Blackstone Intelligence. His name is Jake Morphonios. Now when he was talking about this sort of thing, when he was talking about this book, one thing that attracted me to it was that he described it as this author here, Carol Quigley. He was a person that had rubbed shoulders with the hidden cabal. You know, I like to talk about the people who are manipulating politics and world events behind the scenes and the type of agenda that they're trying to install. And Carol Quigley was one of those people that was right in that circle with them. Maybe not calling the shots, but he was the one who rubbed shoulders with them. He spoke to them. And he ended up writing this book in which he details what they're trying to do. Now, he's not trying to do it as a whistleblower. In fact, it's actually quite the opposite. Carol Quigley actually agreed with the agenda they're trying to do. He agreed with what they were doing. He disagreed with the methods. He didn't want them to operate behind the scenes, but he wanted them to be out front. He wanted them to have their agenda in plain view because he felt that this was the best way to get people on board, as well as dispel sort of the conspiracy theories, I guess you could say. So this is why Carol Quigley wrote this book, and I'm sure you could probably see why that attracted me to it. Now, early on in the book, there's this passage in it, and there's this paragraph, this passage that he ended up saying where he was talking about civilizations. And I found myself continuously coming back to this passage because I couldn't help but see how connected it was, how real it is to what we're experiencing, not just here in Canada, but societies in the West and what we're dealing with. So I've marked the passage here, and we're just going to quickly read it. So he's continuing on something that he was talking about earlier when it comes to civilizations. But he says, from these studies, it would seem that civilizations pass through a process of evolution which can be analyzed briefly as follows. Each civilization is born in some inexplicable fashion and, after a slow start, enters a period of vigorous expansion, increasing its size and power in both internally and at the expense of its neighbors until gradually a crisis of organization appears. When this crisis has passed and the civilization has been reorganized, it seems somewhat different. Its vigor and morale have weakened. It becomes stabilized and eventually stagnant. After a golden age of peace and prosperity, internal crises again rise. At this point, there appears, for the first time, a moral and physical weakness which raises, also for the first time, questions about the civilization's ability to defend itself against external enemies. Racked by internal struggles of a social and constitutional character, weakened by loss of faith in its older ideologies, and by the challenges of newer ideas incompatible with its past nature, the civilization grows steadily weaker until it is submerged by outside enemies and eventually disappears. Now, doesn't that sound eerily similar to what we're dealing with here today in Canada, but also here in the West? I couldn't help, the further along in this book that I went, I couldn't help but flipping back to the beginning and reading this passage over and over because it describes it so perfectly. Because right now we are experiencing that weakness. We are experiencing that crisis of morale, the social and constitutional struggles. We're having that loss of faith in older ideologies, and we're seeing the clash between old ideas and new ideas, old ideologies and new ideologies coming to a head. We're having that question about whether we can defend ourselves. If we're talking militarily, then it's how the Canadian forces has become so weak. We don't have the personnel in order to defend our borders, and how we rely on being kept safe by our American neighbors with their strong military. And we're passing through this phase right now. Canada, I would say, in this golden period that they're trying to talk about, probably reached its peak at about somewhere between World War I to World War II, most likely closer to World War II. And then we hit that stagnation period. And then, as it explains, it's going about this reorganization of the country. Now, this ended up taking place in about the 1980s, when Pierre Elliott Trudeau was in office. And this was the time when Canada became a completely independent country from Great Britain. This is when we also had the Canadian Charters of Rights and Freedoms that was installed. This was a big reorganization that ended up happening. And then since then, we've seen how this crisis is returning, this crisis of identity, this crisis of ideologies. We're having the struggles of both social and constitutional. So it's almost laying out exactly what we're dealing with. And then this is when you're starting to get the violence that breaks out. Because as it goes on further into this book, Carol Quigley begins talking about the 3 ages that a civilization passed through. Now, the first one happens just after the creation of the civilization, of the country, in which it begins slow, but then there's an age of expansion, and this will be an expansion of geographical area, an expansion in population, an expansion in knowledge, and an expansion in production. And that's all something Canada's already gone through. We've seen the expansion of our population. This was what the creation of our railway system was. It was during the time when America was also starting to establish its own geographical area. We built our railroads across the country in order to define our borders against what the Americans were, as well as, if we didn't, the Americans were most likely going to take that unclaimed territory. And we saw how we had it at the expense of our neighbors. So we had already our age of expansion. And then the second age that a society passes through, a civilization passes through, is known as the age of conflict, or the age of crisis. Now in this, you have a decrease in expansion in pretty much all these areas. You have public and class conflict that arises, seemingly endless imperial wars, and growing irrationality, pessimism. These are all part of what is known as the age of conflict, or the age of crisis. Now, I prefer using the term age of crisis, so that's what I'm going to continue doing. And we're seeing how this is end up happening. In terms of population, in terms of production, Canada is reached that point in the age of crisis, because our population is only expanding through immigration. We're also having our production right now that is lowering. We're seeing as jobs are not as readily available as they used to be. We're seeing as there are a number of Canadians that are in a terrible place right now. We're talking about 50% of the country that are $200 away from insolvency, and I'm sure a lot of the people watching this probably fall in that category. So we're having the growing irrationality right now that we're experiencing, despite the fact we're in an age of information, where you can find out anything you want as fast as you can at the tip of your fingers. With all these search engines, we're still at a point where irrationality is probably at its highest that it has been for a long time. So we're going through this age of crisis right now. And then after the age of crisis, it is the age of universal empire. Now, this kind of comes out of the age of when it involves endless imperial wars, which Canada doesn't apply to Canada nearly as much. But if we look towards the Americans, we can see how this is kind of playing out. Because America is more active around the world today militarily than they have been in all of their history. And this ended up coming out after World War II. And in fact, even that in and of itself, what happens in the age of universal empire, is kind of it played itself out in a way when it came to World War II. Because what ends up happening in the age of universal empire is what follows the age of crisis, is that throughout these imperialist wars, all other factions, more or less, are destroyed until one faction arises as the dominant power on Earth. Now, this is what ended up happening after World War II is that was when they reached their peak, and they became the strongest country, one of the biggest countries in terms of their economy, but a large country in terms of their population as well, throughout the entire world. And the thing is about the age of universal empire is it also tends to come with this. It tends to come with a one government, one leader. This is sort of how it ends up playing out. A tyrannical dictator, if you want. Not necessarily tyrannical, but a dictator, if you want. And this can be seen played out in different civilizations throughout history. A good one we can look to are the Greeks. Because the Greeks ended up, if we go early on into their history, you had the Cretans, the Minoan Empire at the time, and this was from the island of Crete, and they dominated the Greek landmass. Now, this ended up getting the Cretan Empire ended up getting more or less destroyed by the Dorian Greeks, and these were the people who came from the north of Greece, and they made their way southward, and they ended up settling in the Peloponnesians. The most famous example of the Dorian Greeks are the Spartans, because the Dorians ended up setting up shop in the Peloponnese. That's where the Spartans are from. Eventually, one of those groups of Dorians ended up forming the city of Sparta. And then they had this great expansion from there. At one point, the Hellenistic culture, which is Greek culture, was the most dominant culture in the entire Mediterranean, which was the relevant part of the world at that time. So they ended up expanding, and then they had their own internal crisis. There were already situations in which there was war between these city-states, because Greece at that time was a country in name only, but they had certain allegiances when it came to things such as language, such as culture, such as religion, which is why during probably the movie 300, where all these Spartans, all these Greeks came together to fight the Persians, it wasn't because they were a country uniting behind a common enemy. It was a culture. It was religions. It was languages uniting against a common enemy. And not even that many, because according to the history books, funny enough, more Greeks fought on the side of the Persians than fought on the side of the resistance, the side of the Spartans, the side of the Athenians. And then after that ended up happening, there was a conflict between the Spartans and the Athenians because they were fighting for dominant power. Now, Athens had always been sort of that dominant power, and one thing that gave them that dominant power was their strong navy. But they were also at the time empire building. So they were making their way across the Greek mainland, but even across the, I think it's the Aegean Sea. Even across the Aegean Sea over to Ionia, which is you're getting over to what is modern-day Turkey. It's around that area, modern-day Turkey, heading towards the Middle East. So what ended up happening is there was a conflict between the Greeks and the Athenians, the Spartans and the Athenians. The Spartans ended up coming out on top. But this whole civilization, the Hellenistic period, it all came crashing down, and it was taken over by a dictator. And that was Alexander the Great. He conquered all of mainland Greece, and then he ended up going towards the east, in which he destroyed the Persian Empire. Completely destroyed it, took one of the largest empires in the entire world, made his way all the way from Greece over to India, and that's where it stopped. And then they, again, when he died, they had their own internal crisis that ripped the empire apart. The thing that is interesting about this is that as Carol Quigley is talking about this situation, as he's talking about what ends up happening, is you have what is called, in your empire, is you got the core. And that would be, I guess I'm going to switch over to Rome because it'll be easier to explain this. So you had the core empire. Now that would have been Italy at the time, where the capital city is, the entire landmass, more or less, of Italy. And then you had the what was called the semi-peripheral empire, and those are areas just outside of its borders. So now we're talking about Spain. We're talking about what was Gaul at the time, which is modern-day France, and parts of Germany. And then you had what was called as the Peripheral Empire. And this is going the farthest reaches of your empire. And what's interesting about it is that it appears that when the Universal Empire falls, it actually comes from a peripheral, one of the parts of the Peripheral Empire that ends up dominating it. So if you look at when Rome was at its peak, it was too large to handle all on its own, so it split into two empires, the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire. When the Western Empire fell, the empire that took it over was the Eastern Roman Empire, who went on to become the Byzantines, the Byzantine Empire that survived for another 1,000 years or something like that. Maybe not quite that much, but it survived for several hundred years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And a good example, too, of how this plays out is what ended up going on in Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamian Empire was conquered by the Babylonians, who ended up eventually being conquered by the Assyrians, the Assyrians were pretty much the Persian Empire as it played out. So this is sort of the way that a civilization plays through. And even we can apply this to our country. We're seeing now as this is how this is playing out. We're having this conflict. We're at a point now where the political left and the political right, they can't see eye to eye, and it's actually leading to the point where we're having conflicts in the street. We're having a federal government that is seceding more power to itself and having more censorship, dictating more to how the public is supposed to act, which they're taking away the power from the provinces and from the municipal governments, and in doing so, they're taking away the power from the people. Now, if we wanted to see how this sort of the age of universal empire would play out in Canada, this is what I think is going to happen. The core empire in Canada, so to speak, is Ontario and Quebec, but not the whole provinces. It's really what people would call the Laurentian elite. So we're talking about Montreal, Quebec City, Ottawa, Toronto, sort of that southern part of Ontario and Quebec. This is where a lot of the influence comes from in Canadian politics. So this is where it's been dominating for a long time. But these two areas are not doing so great these days. We're starting to see how areas such as Quebec is relying on the equalization payments that are coming from Alberta. Now, Alberta is being burdened by the restrictions and the regulations that are being put on by the Canadian government, by their inability to exercise our oil fields out there, the tar sands. So we're seeing this, how Alberta has not the influence that it needs, but it has the economic power that it needs. So I think that when this situation comes to a head, when the whole idea of the Universal Empire is playing itself out, and when it falls, it's going to fall here. And the new area of influence is going to end up being Alberta. Now, this will play itself out in two ways. One, Alberta will separate, which means that from there, it will become an economic powerhouse, most likely. An economic powerhouse that Canada will have to do deals with. It will and because of this, it's going to have a lot of people that are willing to move there. Life will be prosperous there, which probably means there'll be a boom in population. Probably from people that are immigrating from Canada, but also the fact that now these families can afford to have more children. They're going to play that self out. So we'll see the growth. We'll see the return to the age of growth in Alberta. Or Alberta will stay. But when we reach a point where we're at a crisis, maybe economically, when the next financial collapse comes, Canada is going to have to use Alberta, use its resources in order to get out of the problem that we're in. And in doing so, Alberta is going to gain influence because now they have all the cards. While the rest of Canada is sitting there with maybe a pair at the poker table, you're going to have Alberta that has the full house. So now they get to call the shots. The influence is going to switch from sort of central to eastern Canada over to the western provinces over there, specifically Alberta. So we're going to see how this plays itself out. But in the meantime, we're in the point of the age of crisis. And it'll play itself out in two ways. there'll be a reorganization. There'll be a reorganization that ends up happening in Canada that will change things. And I think in a way we're seeing that play out, but not in a good way. Remember, when Justin Trudeau came into office, he was a guy that said that he's going to change Canada. We're not going to recognize Canada when he's done. And a lot of people feel that way. They feel in even the first 4 years of him as Prime Minister, it played itself out in such a way that they don't recognize their country anymore. They don't recognize the values that it's supposed to stand for. They don't recognize the people because he increased immigration drastically, which is actually causing more social conflict right now, as we're seeing that we're having these clash of ideologies. Problems that we never had to deal with, discussions we never had to have, we have to have now. Things such as female genital mutilation being one. As we're seeing that on the rise in Canada, we're seeing there are more people that are coming here that are, if they're not finding ways to get it done in Canada, they're taking their children, going abroad, having it done, and then returning to Canada. This clash of ideologies, when you actually have a political party in Ontario that is advocating for Sharia law, and they're allowing Sharia law in the court systems, at least in civil courts, then we're seeing that this clash of old ideologies and this clash with new ideologies. And it'll play itself out either by we're going to need a reorganization of the way the thing's is done, the way that Canada functions, or it's going to tear itself apart. And when it tears itself apart, it will bring about the age of universal empires, supposedly. And this, again, would probably be where Western Canada falls into this. If the country in some way was to get torn apart, there you would probably see a number of places that would secede and probably try and form a new area, which would be in Western Canada. Probably started off by Wexit, but then other provinces would probably try and tag along with them if things got that bad. Now, the thing is that is quite interesting, as Carol Quigley points out, is one reason that European and Western civilization has been so dominant in the world for such a long time is because the Europeans have always been good at reorganizing themselves. Reorganizing, shaking off the shackles of dictatorships, which can be so prominent in areas such as Africa, the Middle East, and even areas in Asia. But Europeans have never really had that history, or not for a long time. So they've been good at shaking off these shackles and reorganize themselves, and probably the best example of that is France. I think I saw it calculated one time that the French people, on average, have overthrown their government, overthrown their system about once every 60 years when it comes to modern history, over the last few hundred years, about once every 60 years. And they're doing it again right now. If you've been paying attention to what's going on in France right now, some of you may not know this, but right now, France is on about the 64th or 65 week straight of protests. You probably heard about the Yellow Vest protest that was going on in about November of 2018. They're still happening. I mean, just like a week ago, the French fire departments in Paris were having street battles with the police departments. As Macron has tried to force himself into a position of dictatorship, just similar to what Justin Trudeau is doing now, and he's using his police thugs in order to enforce this. The French people are fighting back, which means that something will probably come out of this. And it's not just about a gas tax. It's not simply just about a gas tax. It's not about pension reforms, but it has to do with the behavior and what's happening politically and socially over there. I've reached out on Twitter a couple times to a few people who are commenting about what's going on, about the yellow vests and that. And I asked them, this can't just be about, most recently protests are about pension reform, as they say in the news. But I asked them, this can't just be about pension reforms, right? Like, what's the other cause behind this? And they ended up saying, it has to do with the way that Macron's behaving, the way he's treating the French people and the French culture, the way that he thinks of himself and how little he thinks of the Canadian people, the French people. And I think in a lot of ways, you can compare that to the way that Trudeau has handled this situation here. The difference is that Canada is not built on people who came from a revolutionary history and culture. The French people, the Quebec people, they could trace their history back, for sure. But in general, this country was not founded on a revolution. It was not founded on a war. It doesn't have that same spirit, if you want, that you can maybe see in the United States and in France. So because of that, Canadians have become passive. They don't believe that a lot of the bad things that happen in the world can come here. They don't believe that they'll ever have to take to the streets in violence or overthrow their own government. And this is why we're passively accepting more and more tyranny in our country. This is why we're allowing ourselves to be, say, disarmed. You know, the whole idea of you may have to defend yourself from your own government doesn't resonate here because Canadians have never had to defend themselves from their own government. So because of it, they think when you use that example, they don't take it seriously. A lot of Canadians don't take it seriously. They say, that's unnecessary. It's never going to happen. Don't be trying to bring American Second Amendment platitudes into Canadian politics. And if something doesn't change, it'll get to the point when suddenly Canadians are going to wake up and realize that they're in a dictatorship. And this probably won't happen until some law is put into place that allows the current government to either dissolve other political parties or dissolve elections or something that is keeping them in power for an extended period of time, either an extended period of time or doesn't really give for permanently, more or less. And by this time, it's going to be too late. We already see the signs. We see how we're in the age of crisis right now here in Canada. But nobody wants to do anything about it. And the problem with that is when the time comes that Canadians feel they need to stand up, they need to fight back against their government, they're going to be at such a disadvantage that the only possible outcome is submission, return to your submissive position, or you're going to have to prepare for a lot of people to be injured, jailed, and killed. Because those are going to be the other option. Because the government will have all the guns, they'll have all the armored vehicles they need to put down a rebellion, and Canadians will be stuck there with their fists, maybe a baseball bat. But a baseball bat doesn't do much good against a gun, let's say. And you can't expect the help from the police. Maybe the armed forces, a lot of the people who fight in there, that's a possibility. But again, the problem with that is when the Canadian government in 2018 allowed foreign nationals to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces in exchange for Canadian citizenship, they don't have the same loyalty to the people as, say, someone who was born here, raised here, has that Canadian spirit. That you'll start to see that there'll be the people who are on the side of the Canadian government who will fight with the Canadian government in order to suppress the civilian uprising will be those foreign nationals. So you can see how we're at the disadvantage here. But it's interesting because I read that passage into Carol Quigley's book and I kept coming back to it because I couldn't help and see how it was being played out, how it applied so much to what we're dealing with. And I'm sure many of you, with the explanation that I've given, could probably see, even of yourself, find other examples in which this way applies. And what I'm going to do is, this was a PDF version of the book. I have the physical book. I will put this PDF into the description below, and as far as I can tell, it's got all the pages, because the book is over 1,000 pages long. This has 1,367 pages in it, so you can go check it out yourself. You can download it, you can read it, do whatever you want with it. But that way you can also check out the passage. You can even read a few pages further and start seeing what Carroll Quigley was talking about in terms of the age of expansion, age of crisis, and the age of universal empire. And we'll see how it plays itself out. Anyway, thank you all for tuning in. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is just my stupid opinion.